First of all, thank you very much for joining us both in person and online. I'd like to welcome you to the second and final event of our laboratory for the study of philanthropy, solidarity, and care, Solid Care Lab. Our lab is focused on different aspects of understanding care, and today we're talking about a topic that's near and dear to, I think, all of our hearts, and that's medical anthropology. So we're very happy to talk about what is essentially the fastest growing subdiscipline of social or cultural anthropology, depending on what part of the world you're in, and we'll talk more about that, I think, as we get into the discussions. So the idea behind today is actually to start a conversation about what is medical anthropology and what does it entail to study and think about, to work as medical anthropologists in this region, to do research, medical anthropological research in former Yugoslavia, to do research as what we would call native anthropologists, what the experience is like for the non-native anthropologists, and where we're half-native anthropologists. So today we've actually, we deliberately use the title Open Talks. Today we don't really have any particular presentations in mind. The idea is to talk openly about the topic of medical anthropology and discuss possibilities of sort of making it more visible or coherent here in the region, and what those that ideal would entail in practice. And for that, we're very lucky, and it's really by pure chance we have the opportunity to have two really great medical anthropologists who work in the field of mental health in Belgrade at the same time. So I mean, this is really a particularly great chance, and we're very happy to have it. So in that sense, this event is co-organized by our institute and the Institute for the Ethnographic Institute, the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences. So I'm going to briefly present our guest from Croatia, Dr. Jelena Kupsjak, who's a dear friend of our institute and our lab, with whom I've had the pleasure and hopefully we'll have the pleasure of collaborating further. Jelena is a medical anthropologist, a professor at the University of Zadar. She teaches medical anthropology to students, and currently with us via Zoom are her students of medical anthropology. So this is at the same time a class and an open discussion. Take notes, students. Jelena does amazing research on the field of mental health in Croatia, and it's really pioneering work. And hopefully we'll get a chance to hear more about the way medical anthropology is taught, because it's a discussion that we can open up about the fact that it's not really in the formal curriculums here in former Yugoslavia as a discipline. So Zadar in that case is very unique for the region. So what is it like to teach medical anthropology? And hopefully she'll give us a bit more insights in what it's like to study mental health in Croatia. Now I'll leave it over to our co-organizer, Ivan Đorđević, for the rest.
Thank you, Ilya. And I can just repeat your words, how delighted we are and happy to have you both here. And I will just briefly introduce Professor Peter Locke, who is coming from Northwestern University. He teaches in Northwestern University's Global Health Studies program, and I can say, because I was privileged enough to be a part of that community during this spring, it's amazing crew, and he's a part of that crew in Global Health Studies there in Amsterdam. Peter Locke is, as he introduces himself, he's a cultural and medical anthropologist, and he gained his PhD from Princeton in 2009. He now teaches at Northwestern. And why is he here? He has conducted, and he's conducting it even right now, a field work in former Yugoslavia, and he used to do a field work in Sierra Leone, which is a particularly interesting part of his career. And I would like to hear something more about that as well today. because this is really a unique experience. And he will say more about his recent publications and what is he working on right now. But what I can say, we are really looking forward to his future book about
both books in Jelena as well.
Yeah. We will finally learn something about ourselves when he finishes this manuscript. So without further ado, I think we can proceed to our guests.
Maybe we could start with a question. I think Ivan posted it very well. How did you both get into the field of medical anthropology? And I think that we can understand different trajectories from your two stories. So if you want to tell us a little bit more of why anthropology, obviously, but also why medical anthropology specifically.
You first, Peter.
Me first.
Yeah, we will talk about Strauss.
Let's go for seniority.
Okay. Well, it's hard to tell these stories concisely because they're so bound up with our personal biographies, what we end up doing with our lives and why, right? But I'll do my best to be as succinct as I can. Why anthropology? First of all, I would say I grew up in the south of the United States in Atlanta, Georgia, in the 1980s, and under Reagan, it was an extremely conservative time in the South. Most of the people I grew up with were evangelical fundamentalist Christians for whom there was one capital T truth, one correct culture, one correct way of being human, very rigid, very dogmatic, and these kids were not so nice to me growing up. And so anthropology, when I found it, my freshman year as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, is where I got my bachelor's degree, was mind-blowing to me because it gave me, I'm trying not to use military metaphors here, but I'm going to use them. It gave me an arsenal of argumentation for dealing with extraordinarily dogmatic and extraordinarily provincial people who were deeply full of bigotry, right? And following American politics, you understand that the strain remains very, very strong in our culture. So anthropology in general drew me for its rigorous countercultural critique and thinking. I found it profoundly affirming to show up in college and have my own instincts that there are many, many, many ways of being human in this world that should not be judged from such provincial perspectives. Having that affirmed as an insight that I had achieved rather than a flaw in my character hooked me, and that was it. Anthropology had me from that point. Medical anthropology for me came quite a bit later. I was, as many young people and many young sort of left-wing people are all over the world, to the extent that you can call our left politics in the US left-wing, because I know that's all relative, right? But like many young people of that orientation, I was deeply and angrily political. As a young person. So I was most drawn to cultural anthropology for its affirmation of difference and heterogeneity in the human experience, and most drawn to political anthropology for its ability to critique the various madnesses in American politics and beyond. So that's where I was in the early stages of my career. And when I went off to Princeton for my PhD, I had a general interest in post-conflict situations or settings, but what I was most interested in at the time were mechanisms of accountability, so war crimes trials. But then spent, and this will be probably a very interesting contrast in our trajectories, coming from the center of empire, not to put too fine a point on it, our orientation as anthropologists and social scientists in America often tends to be outward, and our rites of passage to be admitted to the guild involve going to other cultures and other communities for extended periods of time in a way that depends on our deeply unequal global political economy, right? So we are able to have these extraordinary cross-cultural experiences because of our monopoly on power and money in the global economy in a way where, and I imagine we'll talk about this, anthropologists and most of the rest of the world are only able to study themselves, which is not meant to be a critique, of course. It's simply a reality of the political economy and the opportunities that are available there. But in my world, it's simply common sense that you don't pass the rite of passage unless you go somewhere else. And
you won't get funding.
You won't get funding. And if you want to be a scholar of American healthcare, for example, every advisor you have will recommend that you don't do that until you have gone somewhere else and learned about
until you are 80.
Yeah,
retired.
Until you've paid your dues, right? So the classic trope or idea in American and colonial anthropology is the idea of the savage slot. And this will connect to the slot that medical anthropology fills in just a second. But historically, the idea was, in the history of colonial anthropology, that ours was the discipline that would explain the rest of the world to the empire, which considered itself, and still considers itself, of course, the center of all possible rational thought, right? And everything else, every other culture in the world is interesting through its deviation from that assumed to be universal rationality, right? So that was the slot we historically fulfilled when we were handmaidens to colonialism. And even though over the course of the 20th century, American cultural anthropology became deeply anti-colonial and deeply anti-racist, in the political economy of the American Academy, that's the slot we continue to fill, right, and are expected to fill, that we speak for other cultures and communities, which, together with the global political economy that enables this, is obviously deeply problematic in terms of who gets to travel and who gets to speak for whom. And I think that's something that haunts all of our careers, those of us who come from places like America and the UK, that we have this privilege. And also, it was striking to me after I finished the PhD. Before I finished the PhD, nobody thought I knew anything in America or here, But after I got the PhD, suddenly people treated me like an authority on everything, right? And
You're a doctor.
I'm a doctor now, and I'm a white man, right? So all of this authority has been projected on me since I reached that point, in a way that the only way not to lose your soul and become a bad person is to be haunted by that and to be troubled by that, and to make sure that methodologically you include that troubledness in the work that you do. And later on, as I've gained more privilege and power, do everything I can to elevate the voices of scholars like the folks here who don't have the opportunities that come in my world. So, but back to my short story, which is becoming long, as I warned you. I'll try to get a little more to the point here. How did I get to medical anthropology? There was first the post-conflict interest, a general interest in what had happened in Yugoslavia, because when all of that went down in the 90s, those were very formative years for me. And as a young American, it was the 24-hour news cycle, Sarajevo, for 3 years. And that made a big impression on me in my adolescence. And it was something that had always darkly intrigued me, the collapse of this region and the violence that occurred. But again, I was really interested in political accountability, in part because I was young and naive, and I thought there was such a thing. Right? Not to be too cynical, but I was expecting that these processes of accountability would function according to various acceptable and universal legal rationalities, and people would be pleased with them, right? It would feel a sense that there was accountability for what happened in the 90s. I was quickly disabused of that on some summer visits here to scope out possible field sites. And I think learned very quickly that what was much more interesting, at least from an outsider perspective in this region, was how much healing and accountability had not occurred for a variety of reasons, of which everyone here is deeply and frustratingly familiar. So that brought me to the idea of psychological trauma. And that then brought me to medical anthropology as the necessary frame for engaging with mental health. But I should add that it wasn't just this sort of linear intellectual journey from innocence to enlightenment. Some of it was simply personal. The political anthropologist in my department who I'd wanted to work with, who had done a lot of work on Cold War and post-Cold War Berlin, wrote I thought his essays were just wonderful. When I show up to the department and meet him, he's kind of a jerk. And you know, one of these big Ivy League egos who's not a great nurturer of vulnerable young scholars. And that was clear to me quickly. And then the most wonderful human being in my department was, and I think this is not coincidental given what medical anthropologists study. We study a lot of suffering. People drawn to these fields tend to be the empathetic, sensitive ones, you know, who are also gifted teachers and mentors. So
otherwise it's hard to survive.
Absolutely.
It's hard to survive, yeah, especially given what the kind of things that we study. So I found my way to someone who's a very famous medical anthropologist in the Anglo-American world and also Latin America, named João Biel, who is Brazilian originally, and made a very big impact on medical anthropology in my world round about the time that I was becoming a PhD student. And I had never taken medical anthropology as an undergraduate or a grad student. I had kind of avoided it because my father had a career in hospitals as a hospital chaplain, and he was always trying to get me to read Arthur Kleinman and become a medical anthropologist. And I was like, no, Dad, I have to individuate. I have to be my own person. I'm not going to do health. But, you know, we become our parents, right? So eventually I couldn't resist the draw of my background to those kinds of settings, to healthcare settings and settings where people are vulnerable and searching for care. So there were those personal reasons, and then João became my surrogate father, because he was quite a bit like my dad in his orientation. So, you know, many of these, the ways we end up who we are in the intellectual work that we do, I think we should be quite honest about how bound up it is with these kinds of personal and relational dynamics. So I TA'd for, I was teaching assistant for medical anthropology for him. It was the first time I'd encountered it, and it completely blew my mind, opened my world. And I said, this is what I want to do. This is more meaningful to me than abstract deconstructions of various kinds of social inequalities or politics. With medical anthropology, what appealed to me was the people. Not just the systems, not just the policies, not just the abstract cultural values and abstract cultural differences, but the method of deeply interacting and caring for. There's a kind of care in our methodology, I think. People who are vulnerable and who are, this is the point I would underline, are embodying all those abstract things in their health and their mental health. In other words, you don't need to make politics an abstraction to understand it deeply. If you meet somebody who's suffering, they are probably at least partially suffering because they are embodying the toxic politics of their context. So it becomes, for me, a much more human and a much more humane entry point into these broader dynamics that we all care about. So that was my conversion experience to medical anthropology, and from there I retooled my entire research and fieldwork designed to focus on humanitarian psychiatry and interventions in the late 90s and early 2000s in Bosnia and Sarajevo that were attempting to diagnose and treat traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder.
I'm going to stop you right there,
So
because that's the second part of our conversation where we want to dive in a little bit more about your research specifically. But thank you for that insight, and I think it was crucial to highlight how much our personal intertwines with our public, and I think that's sort of key in all aspects of medical anthropology. I mean, I came into it because the field side I wanted to do no longer existed, which was again peopling institutions. But I would like to refrain João Biel again here, and I think Jelena might interject.
I would also like for João Biel to be my father.
So Jelena, can you tell us
Surrogate father.
what was it like becoming a medical anthropologist in the Croatian context?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I am a medical anthropologist. It's kind of, I mean, in Croatia, my degree is in ethnology and anthropology, and as such, I mean, that's cultural anthropology. You are the one that called me medical anthropology, and the work I did could be put under the practice of medical anthropology, and I also teach medical anthropology. But what am I? That's depending on who you ask. Thank you, Peter, for your opening and everything. Like our stories are at the same time very far apart, and different, and then at the same time also very similar in different regards. But I only discard, I mean, in the context of Croatian anthropology as such is not a visible discipline, and this is not something I wanted to study or had any idea about it. Actually, I wanted to study psychology, and I enrolled into a psychology program at the University of Zadar, but after a very short time, 2 semesters, and a lot of conflict at the department, I realized this is not the type of thing that I wanted to. And of course, the reasons why I wanted to study psychology are also kind of personal, in a sense of, and having this idea of naively helping people who suffer, you know, having this experience of living among people who suffer from things that I could not understand at the time, or even now, in a sense. And so this is why I was focused on psychology as such. But I discontinued my studies to enroll into sociology, and it's through sociology that actually introduced me to anthropology, through a few beautiful people that were doing work there. First of all, my supervisor, Senka Božić-Verbančić, who did her PhD in social anthropology in New Zealand, and through beautiful work of Biljana Kasić, who's a feminist scholar in Croatia, and she introduced me, so the two of them introduced me to different types of theory, mostly post-colonial critique and feminist studies that deal with specific issues, that opened up for me, you know, that this is actually what I've always wanted to. This is what my curiosity was constantly leading me to, in a sense. And I enrolled in my MA in anthropology, and I also had a luck, let's say luck, it was a contingency in a sense, also that while there was at that time a professor at the Department of Anthropology that was teaching ethnomedicine at the time. And I enrolled into this program and get to know Arthur Kleinman and you know, basics of the discipline itself. And eventually I started to do my PhD, and the topic itself also, how it all went, and it's filled with different types of embodied being, positioned in a very specific place, living in a very specific context, and being interested in very specific topics. I actually also came through the questions of gender to my topic of mental health, let's say, by encountering on my field work for another stuff, for something else, encountering a few stories that kind of, you know, got me thinking, let's say, and that's how it all started. And eventually, also by contingency, the person that taught me ethnomedicine has decided to quit her job. And I was fortunate enough to actually get her job and to continue teaching ethnomedicine at the time. But I actually switched and changed the name of into medical anthropology and ethnomedicine. And it's been 7 or 8 years now that I've been teaching this course. And I want to thank my students for being here. They are now here because this is also the time on Fridays where I teach medical anthropology. They're a diverse group of students. You know, this is an introductory course. It's nothing very deep in a sense of theory or what, you know, because we are just trying to open up spaces for thinking about healthcare, care, about structural violence, and about, we are currently, what we are doing actually is also in terms of psychiatry, but this year we've decided to do shock therapy by Matza.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great.
University of Pittsburgh.
So we are focusing on some of these issues in a sense. So that's a kind of story of me, all filled with different types of contingency, because in our region, truly, I mean, neither anthropology nor medical anthropology have this or visibility or tradition of practice, or even, you know, but I would just also like to say in Croatia there is another person that teaches medical anthropology at the department in Zagreb, Tanja Bukovčan, and she also did her PhD in the context of the healthcare system and alternative medicine in Croatia. So, but this is a kind of lonely, it was a kind of lonely, you know, trip in a sense. And you see after the COVID now, you see this flourishing of topics. I see PhD students starting to engage with medical anthropology, and I see a lot of new work being done specifically in this regard by our Institute for Ethnology too, you know, because these topics have now become extremely visible. Yeah, again.
We'll talk about that future that we're collaborating on a little bit later, but I'll leave Ivan, if you want to continue with the next round of questions.
Okay. No, but I would like to hear more from both of you about your fieldwork, because that's something I think for everyone here the most interesting thing we should ask. We could ask you in a way like about your general experiences of fieldwork in Bosnia. That's something I would like to hear. For the beginning.
So I'll start. All right. Again, I will cut me off.
No problem.
If you need to. No problem. That's the spirit. Yeah. Yeah. Again, a very long story. Let's see if I can boil it down. You know, again, I have to intertwine the personal with this because, and I think this will be a very interesting contrast for us as an outsider doing field work in the region and as a native. For me, it was. I mean, your first field work is always part of the coming of age process, I think, whatever your social positionality and wherever you're doing it. Ethnographic field work requires, to understand the social dynamics around you, requires a great deal of personal growth at whatever stage you are in your development as a person. And the stage I was when I came to Sarajevo was quite an early one. I was maybe 24, 25 years old when I started going there. I'm an American, I'm not polyglot. I have to start learning the language from scratch, and it has continually, frustratingly defeated me for the last 15 to 20 years. But my point is that this wasn't just about me going to Bosnia. This was about me as a young, relatively privileged American with a fairly elite education, really getting immersed in a significantly different culture for the first time. I had spent a semester in Paris as an undergrad, right? Paris is not Sarajevo, is not Belgrade, obviously. So it was much more challenging for me personally, I think, in terms of the kinds of differences that I was faced with and had to struggle to understand. And then, of course, the kinds of experiences that people had survived in Bosnia and in Sarajevo that were still quite fresh for them. When I started going there, it was 2004, 2005, right? So only a few years since the siege had ended. So I was young. I've always been a relatively shy, introverted person. So fieldwork is an interesting choice of career for me, where you basically have to have a lot of chutzpah to go talk to strangers and impose on their time and charm them into believing that it's worthwhile to spend some time with you and share their knowledge. And I was young. I looked like a baby. People would ask me what I was majoring in university, when I was doing my fieldwork, etc. So it was difficult to be taken seriously by anybody. The language was a struggle, and I had the very humbling experience, a very necessary experience of realizing that to people in the world, the value of researchers and research is not self-evident, and people are often quite skeptical toward this, especially in regions like the former Yugoslavia that have a long history of basically being colonized, occupied, studied, treated like lab rats for various imperial, Western, Eastern, whatever powers, right? And of course, that's a story that applies to much of the world, not just this region, especially when you have someone like me coming from a global center of power to study experiences in social life in a place like the Balkans, which, of course, the capital W, West, and Western Europe constantly others and constantly sort of either tacitly or quite explicitly puts at an earlier stage of cultural and civilizational evolution. You know, those echoes of 19th century cultural evolutionary thinking about the world remain deeply in place in so many ways, right? So I went around to non-governmental organizations, this baby-faced 25-year-old, 26-year-old in Sarajevo, half knowing the language, started cold calling, knocking on doors and saying, hey, I've come here to study post-trauma interventions.
What a nice introduction.
And a lot of doors were closed right on my face, not necessarily because of how I was very polite and well-mannered, but that's when I learned that there was a long history, especially in Sarajevo, of people being pissed off about being observed and treated like lab rats by powerful academics and journalists. This goes, of course, to the siege and the experience of having been covered on the 24-hour news cycle that I watched for 3 years as a young person, but nobody did anything about anything, right, until things got truly, truly awful. There's no way to say that without it being a massive understatement, right? So it was an.
You still struggle with the field work there.
Yeah.
I think in terms of what we talked
read,
about,
yeah.
what we read, you still struggle with the ways of how to interpret, how to write about the extreme complexities of everything, and you know, on both ethical grounds of like representation and about who you are as a being a white American male who comes into Sarajevo and like, hey, I'm here, I'm going to tell you what you're doing here.
Exactly. You know, and then studying something like trauma, nobody knows, particularly in this region where medical anthropology isn't terribly well established, or, you know, in my world, medical anthropology is king, or maybe we should say queen of the cultural subdisciplines and orientations. It has become very powerful and very prestigious in the last 20, 30 years, and one of the few areas where, I mean, whenever I say academic job market, I got to do this because it's a joke to call it a market, right? There are, there are 1,000 deeply qualified PhDs for every really, good middle-class academic job to get in the United States. In medical anthropology, and the study of global health inequalities through medical anthropology has become one of the few pathways that is certainly not safe, but might be your only chance of landing somewhere, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, coming from
the American system,
from the half native, right, the perspective as a Serbian doing a PhD in the United States, focusing on medical anthropology, the fact that I applied for a job in the States working on mental health with vets and the entire vet, system and institutions related to helping U.S. vets has really embraced medical anthropology.
Yes, it has. The Veterans Administration, which is one of our forms of socialized medicine, which the right wing pretends we don't have, right? It's very inconvenient that we actually have several forms of socialized medicine in the United States. In the Veterans Administration in the last few decades, my colleagues that I went through with, the other ones who landed, it's not a coincidence that I didn't land in an anthro department. I landed in an interdisciplinary program for the study of global health. And my other colleagues who made it, most of my colleagues that went through grad school with me are working for tech now. They're working for Intel or Google, trying to get people to buy stuff they don't need, whereas some of my colleagues ended up in the VA.
Most of mine as well, either in the VA or directly for the military, directly for the Department of Defense. So in that sense...
Which is wild because the American Anthropological Association will literally kick you out if you work with the U.S. military. So.
Yes. So I'm only interjecting this to sort of highlight the differences in possibilities of working outside of academia and how medical anthropology translates into different aspects of life. So here it's still sort of mostly within the civil sector, but not really recognized as...
Not at all. Like I was...
Even is actually a key representative of that.
How...
Can you tell us more even about your experience then?
My US experience was completely shocking for me because I realized that medical anthropology actually exists there. And people treat you with respect. Here it's still not recognized at all. So basically what we do here is, trying to And it was start a discussion that there is such thing as, in my experience here, because I mostly work with Roma communities, and they are, as you all know, basically like the most marginalized and discriminated communities in Serbia and the region, like not just here, but in Eastern Europe as well. My experience of talking to anybody who is like involved in different kind of mental health practices is that they treat you as someone who is coming to, who is a threat, who tries to, I don't know, make a critique of their work in a way that like will harm them. And I was trying to explain to people that my job is to help them to work better, to like be engaged with the community where they work with, and somehow it's still a tough job. And that's why I think it's important to introduce a different approach, that basically we are here to help.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point to make, because of course cultural anthropology and medical anthropology, at least in the Anglo-American strain, is deeply shaped by and deeply immersed in various forms of deconstructive post-structuralist social theory that are deeply critical of helping institutions. This is the influence largely of Foucault, I think, on our discipline over the last few decades, that he famously took things that are supposed to be good, capital G good, healthcare, criminology and prisons, psychiatry and mental health care, et cetera, and said, maybe not so good. Maybe all of these things are actually still continuing to be various forms of social control that reinforce and perpetuate various kinds of inequalities. And that's what, you take any work of medical anthropology, that point is there, right? That critical point that these are institutions that are helping institutions, and we should value the good intentions here, but there are many, many blind spots to the forms of inequality and suffering and violence that are being introduced. That's not an easy thing to tell people who are working hard under a lot of really excellent intentions. But the last thing I'll say, because you and I probably have, and you and I as well probably have a very different experience in this, I've had the experience of people not trusting me in these institutions and assuming correctly that I might be delivering a critique of their work, but of course in the interests of making the world a better place, right? And
with like high appreciation of their work.
Yes,
they're doing a great job.
But just as often, because I am, a privileged American anthropologist.
So I'm taking away that privilege from you.
But with that structural position I've got, there have also been a lot of people who want to impress me, to impress the American, and say, please don't assume that we are backward and uncivilized, and we stink at healthcare, and we stink at mental health. Let us show you the extraordinary work that we're doing, right? And so that's probably a very different kind of impression and research relationship than I imagine as locals yourselves. You get much more distrust.
Yeah. Jelena, would you like to tell us a bit more about your experiences, as much as you can?
At the moment, when I enrolled in my PhD and I submitted kind of a short idea of what I would like to do in terms of mental health. Even that itself was controversial. And once my topic had to go through all of the commissions and stuff you need to approve the topic itself, one of the first comments that I got was, you need to have a psychiatrist in your commission. So in terms of fieldwork,
to validate your work, to validate your...
Yes, but not to just to judge what I have done, you know, and that's like from the first. But then when I started to like trying to talk to people, and then other issues kind of surfaced. Of course, there's no visibility for what medical anthropologists do, so I would usually say, you know what sociology is, you know, it kind of is trying to, you know, get on the same ground, those type of stuff. But I also, you know, we understand that healthcare and healthcare systems is filled with male psychiatrists with a lot of masculine figures and stuff, and you see how I look. And you can also imagine how I looked maybe 10 years ago when I was not taken very seriously in any regard, anywhere, neither intellectually, academically, in any way. If anything, I was not seen as a threat. I was seen very benign. Like somebody,
as irrelevant.
Yes, irrelevant. And this is the part that actually, and the reasons why I had to really adjust my fieldwork and my topic itself into a more kind of, what it actually ended up doing, you know, is kind of trying to explain and see all of these things that happened during transition. So I kind of went into this reading of the laws and, you know, economic transition and the policies and public policy in general, and the questions of representation and different kind of stuff that happens around psychiatry in Croatia. But I also wanted to I wanted to ditch this idea of psychiatry in itself, even though I started with this idea, and because I was dealing with the concept of mental health. And the concept of mental health, I don't know, I mean, it's not something that was used as such, and it's not here to just talk about like pathology and all those like medical stuff. And in the sense, the concept was made to kind of widen and put it in a kind of proactive and place to kind of be something that we all have or don't have. And so I wanted to go into the everyday life and see how the mental health concept works here, especially because I don't know, maybe this is similar in Serbia, but the concept itself was not used as such at all. You would use psychiatric illness, duševne bolesti. You would talk in those type of concepts. And then all of a sudden, with European integration and all of these processes, you know, and the documents all of a sudden started to, you know, talk about mental health in different ways. And so this is also something that I wanted to cover in a sense. And so my fieldwork really took me a lot of places. But in terms of like dealing with people, with people in the medical establishment, during the time it was like I said, very hard, and I was non-existent. The things kind of changed a bit since I got my PhD. There's a little bit more, you can see that people respond differently, but I haven't started any new research at this point, you know. You see that some kind of spaces are all of a sudden opened for me in terms of communication with different actors in the public health system in Croatia. So I see that some things are like shifting and changing, but you know, you see from this, it's a kind of complex type of relationship, you know, that, and psychiatry truly still is and has this this masculine, patriarchal, and very, you know.
It partakes of some of the toxic and patriarchal histories of medical authority in general, right? And a long history, of course, of psychiatry being a tool of social control and confinement. And there's a lot of good in that history, but there's a lot of darkness as well.
And then me as researcher and like I said, my gender and the way I look and the way I talk and all of it is kind of not seen in that space, or it was not seen at the time. You know, I should not generalize to the entire, you know, but these are the kind of experiences that I had at the time. You know,
I want to thank you both for both telling us your paths and the way that your research took place, because I think we're mapping a couple of key points that are intersecting between these different experiences. And one of them is obviously a key question that we're trying to think through is the question of access. Access into these institutions, especially in spaces like former Yugoslavia or spaces where, unlike the US context, where even the questions of clinical studies are something which is a different topic altogether, but questions about doing social research in closed spaces that have not seen themselves as, they have always seen themselves as spaces that do research and not as spaces where research can be done.
They're the subjects, not the objects.
Right, the subjects, not the objects of research. So when you switch that around, and I mean,
They don't like it.
as you're speaking about,
even though they don't like it, they don't understand what you're doing.
so I think that's really, I think we're seeing it in both your, in Ivan's and I think in mine and in a lot of our conversations about the question of how to gain access and this idea of, you've both mentioned it, right? The moment you get your PhD, some doors open, other doors may never open. We might try to jarringly try and open them, and these are the issues that I think are similar in these aspects. But what is clear, at least to me from this conversation, is the importance of really, both from your stories and the fieldwork, is the interplay of our personal and informal, in not just how that shapes our careers, but that shapes our questions to access, that shape our questions of what questions we are interested in understanding, what things we see and things we don't see. And if we can expand a whole conversation about being medical anthropologists and trying from our own embodied perspective, seeing what we perceive as visible or invisible in our context. I spent time in a maternity ward, not being pregnant at the time, not having that experience. And I mean, if I did my research now, I would tell you it would definitely look completely different than it did, those couple of years ago. So I think we're seeing a lot of questions. You both opened up the questions of power, privilege, and coloniality, and I think it's fragmented. And this is an interjection into what we're hopefully be talking in Zadar in April, even further. But it's what Jelena and I have been thinking through in regards of the two concepts of fragmentation and frictions. So it's the ways in which our healthcare systems in former Yugoslavia are fragmented, the ways in which we approach them are fragmented, our experiences are fragmented.
Which is interesting because the forces at play are actually trying to connect it all.
Yes.
They are trying to universalize everything, but it's still so much. There's so much diversity in the ways that all of these forces kind of affect the institutions and the practices of care and different places.
Absolutely, but I wanted to highlight on the because we've you both highlighted on the negative aspects of this work. So being the doors closed, the fact that we're studying this other, and what particularly when Jelena and I spoke about frictions in relations to the Balkans have always, especially in anthropology, been studied as this internal combustible problem, the fragments and frictions being seen as potentials for negativity and violence, and we're trying to rethink it through the idea of frictions as positivity, as sort of what are the new ways of thinking.
Not necessarily positive, but without
productivity.
Without coming in with the kind of either positive or negative, it's just
this is spaces of new understanding,
of encounters and of doing communication. This is where things happen. These are the events.
And to do medical anthropology in this region, as you wrote so well in the chapter that you sent me, is to deal with these frictions between, as Anna Singh, totally nailed in her work, between purported universals generally generated from centers of power that then travel. So how does this concept of mental health, which is, I've been teaching Gen Z in the United States, they are the mental health generation. Everything is mental health. Everything with them. But they also do not understand that their sense of mental health is deeply provincial, right? Is deeply limited to the American context. They don't understand that it wasn't this way even 10 years ago. And if you travel anywhere else in the world, you're also going to be met with something different. So the question of what powerful communities assume to be universal, how they export that, but then when it hits the ground, what kind of frictions do you get, I think, is a really fascinating space for medical anthropology to work. But as you say, it's all contingency, what we get access to and what piece of the puzzle that we see and how the relationships that we develop evolve, right? And so what we're going to learn from relationships that evolve in a direction of distrust is not going to be the same as relationships evolve that develop into more and more trust over time.
As Ivan said, we're here to help rather than the distrust. I would thank you both for this, and since we're sort of in the halfway point in time. Even if, would you like to ask the first question before we open it up to our present and virtual audience?
Okay.
I think we're
I think we can switch to questions.
sure giving you the privilege. Because the idea here is imagine that we give the space for more talk, and I think we really have a great audience with us here today. So I'm going to open up the floor to questions, conversation starters. Feel free to.
Well, I would actually like to hear from.
Or you'll be called for by the people.
We're going to cold call you one by one, so think of what you're going to say. Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Zoran. So I met Zoran just now, but he's also a medical anthropologist and he does an amazing thing. And I just wanted to ask you, since we kind of said our experience, I would really like to know about yours, because you said you did your PhD and outside here, and you're now working at the institute in Batut. So that's also, yeah.
It's also tricky.
Yeah.
How much can you share?
Yes.
Možda bi bilo poželjno, da.
Hvala.
Zoran, could you introduce yourself?
Yes. I'm Zoran Milosavljević. I'm a medical doctor and I work now in the Institute of Public Health of Serbia in the Department for HIV and Sexually Transmitted Diseases. But I mostly did my qualitative study research in the last 15 years regarding HIV in Serbia. But before I say something about my experience as a medical anthropologist, I would just refer to you, Jelena, in your introduction. You said curiosity at one point, so that was also my initial spark to start my journey through medical anthropology. And I'm a medical doctor and have medical background, but the most boring subject in the medical school among 38 subjects that you have to pass during 6 years of medical school for me was psychiatry. Very boring in a sense that even you face some kind of experiences from different people and patients that you come across. That was the most interesting part. But when you have to kind of translate them to the medical results, then that was really disappointing for me. And my journey through, let's say, in the research of HIV started because I was unsatisfied with the data or what I can get and how I can know of HIV in the medical school. And that's why I started to do my own research. And I've never encountered, or rarely, very rarely, experiences from people in everyday life. I worked in a primary health care, my first job, and then I was wondering, so wait a minute, what is happening with all those people that I'm encountering every day? So what they do every day? They come to my, let's say, office for prescriptions or whatever. It lasts 10 minutes usually, or 15. We briefly exchange a couple of sentences. But what happens when they step outside of my, let's say, office? Mm-hmm. And then I started to kind of research more, started to read. I think when you start to research in the field of medical anthropology, you really have to be prepared. And what actually Peter said about Yugoslavia, I really have to say that it takes lots of courage to come to that age to the region, let's say. And then
or a lot of naivety.
Yes, yeah. Naivety. Because my impression, I lived for 8.5 years in the UK. My impression that lots of people, and majority of people, don't, even today, they don't understand this region at all. They speak from some kind of pre-built positions. Mm-hmm. They don't understand some basic political, economically related issues and so on. And usually what really annoyed me was when in the UK they speak about Europe. You know, I always have to ask, would you clarify, what do you mean by Europe? And then you realize that
they are not Europe right now.
Yes, they are not, yes. After Brexit, yes. But then you are never sure whether they are referring to European Union as a political subject or they are talking about that. When I ask them, like, what about 44 other states in Europe that they do not belong to the
They're
European
44?
Union? Yeah, I think so, around that. And they were kind of really, especially like blindsided the part of Yugoslavian history related to non-aligned movement. You will never hear about that, and it's much easier, you know, to say like Eastern Europe, Western Europe. That's the division, and that's it. But this is not really true. But let me kind of come back to the
pose them a question.
The question. The field of medical health, let's say the field, it's very diverse. So, what would you consider as the most kind of urging topics now?
The most urgent topics for medical anthros to study?
Yeah, for medical anthropology research in the field of medical health.
I mean, this is truly a hard question, in a sense.
We can think in terms of for this region and in general.
Yeah.
In general.
But it's kind of hard because as an anthropologist, I don't think I would like medicine has disciplines. So you have psychiatry, neurology, and so you can say, I don't know, brain is the most important part. But I don't think that in terms of social care, in terms of like sociality and questions of care, I believe that truly the way that we, you know, every aspect is important depending on how are we living it, who are you know, not everybody, not everything is everybody's in a sense, you know, but we do share this together, we do share this every day, let's sort of say, and so maybe in that sense mental health could truly be the thing that is so important, because it's the one thing that's also preventing us from like seeing other things that happen in the field of care, not just in terms of like the medical systems and, you know, but the questions of when I read Peter, for example, and Bosnia and Herzegovina is not my field work. It's not something that I'm familiar with, and the context, even though like maybe similar, it's very different than in Croatia. However, the question of when I read parts of like when they say like we all have PTSD and those, I can really kind of see this in terms of Croatian. You can see this in the media, in the politics. You can see a kind of problems that that are in every one of us, in a sense, you know, and that make the system the way it is kind of dysfunctional at the moment. I mean, not that maybe the care systems were never functional to an extent, but at one point, I think there was this idea led by social medicine of what care systems should be. And I'm saying here also, but I'm talking about both social and healthcare, because I do believe that these two are incredibly connected and important. And I do think that in Yugoslavia, there was not such huge distinction made between questions of the social and questions of the health, in a sense.
Could you expand on that a little bit more, please? Because I think your research was on very crucial about, you mentioned the non-aligned movement, but also it's really important to mention the history of public health, not just Yugoslav public health, but global public health owes its dues to people
yeah.
So I'd open it up to Jelena.
I was reading like this World Health Bank kind of reports on Croatia and suggestions, and I was like constantly, I would always stop at one point where you see a question coming from the World Bank: why does Croatian healthcare system pay maternity leave? And questions about, you know, maternal health and workers' rights and blah, blah, blah. So why, and they would constantly like, why is like the question of bolovanje, porodilni,
parental leave.
Why is it funded through the healthcare system and not through social welfare system? So, and there are many points when I was reading this type of reports where I saw that there are some kind of divisions that, in terms of concepts, that I couldn't really understand where they're coming from, especially since I was educated in this very new ethno-national context where my education was nationalized in a sense of like, I don't know, during my education, it would be unheard of for me to like get to know what's happening in Serbia, for example, in terms of this type of issue. It would be, you know, does it exist? You know, and
what do you do in Croatia? We have no idea.
And then I would read, for example, the Croatian articles that would like from people that are health economists, for example, like Slaven Letica, that would speak of current system as a kind of, I don't know, all the troubles that are currently here are from the past. So we have inherited these problems. The problems, you know, are not...
Discourse.
Absolutely.
And so I had a very hard time understanding all of this. And so I spent a lot of time kind of catching up with Andrija Štampar. It's a strange type of
I did the same with Batut, so it was really an interesting
conversation. But it's like, in a sense, I wanted to really know what's happened here. I could not understand the Yugoslav healthcare and social system and everything basically was a kind of mystery to me. Like it's even you could know it exclusively only as a kind of oppressive system that existed, you know, in the past, or as a kind of like nostalgic view from the people. Like, and these are the only options that were kind of available for me. And of course, I was educated also in a very conservative city and all of this stuff. So this is all. That's how I basically wanted to explore these questions of the social, and that's what got me to Andrija Štampar, and to kind of realize and replace the discourse in Croatia about everything basically is like this colonial self look, like we have to go to this West, we have to like catch it, we have to, and this also means discarding everything from before. Being good, bad, doesn't matter, just discarding it as such. And in this discarding, we also discarded something that I thought was very empowering. Like you said, nesvrstani, unaligned. And the question of healthcare and social system for me have been, and especially in those periods of time, so between the two wars and immediately after, because in the 60s and 70s and 80s you can see these changes coming because the medicine itself is changing, new technology, pharmaceutical industry trying to, you know, and you see all those issues that are happening in the West, happening here too, but it's different. What happens because healthcare in Yugoslavia was a thing that if a treatment that was, you know, it had to be available to everybody on paper, let's say, you know. And so what to do when dialysis machines come, you know, in the 60s, what to do with, and all of a sudden the dialysis becomes this important thing, but you cannot like offer everybody a dialysis machine. It's an expensive machine, it takes a lot of time.
And there was also competition because of self-management. Because they were competing
and buying, and all of this stuff start to come up, you know, and I'm sorry, this is like a huge...
No, it's perfect.
Yeah.
No.
Please keep going.
Yeah, but I forgot, like, where do I
I think you're telling us about the facts that it was hard actually, even with the ideal of equity.
Yes.
The practicalities of equity have always been, so it's never a black and white issue, and it's never that the Yugoslav past can be designated as just bad and we need to forget about it, or
can't even be designated as past. I mean, there are deep ironies here in forgetting or thinking of this history of social medicine and Andrea Stampar in this region of that has to be overcome when the field of global health in the West is precisely discovering social medicine approaches as if it's new and innovative. And I'm always like, hey guys, there have been systems for a century that have paid attention to the social
and not just that they were not just that, but the social medicine, Yugoslavian social medicine was imperative in making the World Health Organization on the basis of social medicine. And I think those kind of heritages kind of need to be known for us to stop thinking of ourselves as people, that just have to follow. But can we think for ourselves? The great health
expertise is at Northwestern, not here. Yes. No. If you would just keep your social medicine traditions and enrich that, there's so much you could teach the capitalists.
You used to live in the States, like Peter was born there. My shock facing how American healthcare system looks.
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying.
It's disgusting.
It's shocking.
I'd like to open this point and invite our guests as well to take a look at our YouTube channel. And if you speak Serbian, to the talk by our really great historian, Radina Vučetić, who talked about, it has a book on variola vera, the epidemic, and sort of the ways in which Yugoslavia was prepared for this epidemic, really speaks volumes about the role of social medicine in that context. And also, more importantly, I think for us here, speaks on the importance of interdisciplinary, long-term, engaged social science research into the field of medicine, especially in the context of former Yugoslavia. Bosnia opens up, that's a whole can of worms right there. But I'll come back to Bosnia and open up some questions again. It's just going back to Stef Jansen's work, who's not a medical anthropologist, but has done really intensive studies, and let's call him really an expert on questions related to Bosnia. He opens his book, Yearnings in the Meantime, with a concept of shared concerns. And I think this is something that a couple of us have been rethinking and thinking through about. So how to get out of this discourse of either black or white, or the colonial, or the questions of power, access, and authority, and to really think about shared concerns within our academic community, be it from the United States, UK, to our co-interlocutors, or the doctors and everyone. So this idea of what are our goals together, what is our history, and what are our trajectories moving forward. But if we can go back to opening questions, I think we have a few questions from the audience. And obviously, please, if you have any questions from our people in Zoom land, feel free to post them in the chat or talk. But I think we have a question from Irena.
Okay.
Irena, please. Can you introduce yourself as well?
Okay, yeah, hi. So my name is Jelena Molnar. I work here at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory as a program development manager, but I also am an anthropologist with master in political science, and I also lead a civil society organization, community-based organization for people who are using drugs and young people who are using drugs. So my field of research in my NGO is drug policy, harm reduction, and care for young people, mental health, those kind of things. So I've been doing this work for 10 years, just because I couldn't really do that research and have a support within the anthropology studies here or political science studies that I wanted really to do. So I've been doing advocacy and research within the government of Serbia, also at the level of United Nations, and as a community member as well. You've been talking about the privilege a lot. And this is something that I was experiencing as well, because I come from the community of people who are using drugs, but I also been privileged to have this education that allows me space to do research so we can make evidence-based policies and services aimed to people who are affected by them, and also who miss those services in that sense. So talking about the privilege, I did what I felt that I needed to do in my 10 years experience to return to my community, being that I felt that I was taking away a huge amount of information and emotions and huge amount of data from what we needed, because in Serbia we had the data on people who are injecting drugs related to HIV. But I work with completely different community that is completely neglected and invisible, because they're not problematic users, but this is 90% of users. So in that sense, I felt the need that we need to make evidence-based policies by the data that we can collect and use and return to the community. So in that sense, I wanted to ask you about plans or envisions of using the privileged position that you are to return to the community that you are researching.
Yeah.
In that sense, like, how do you feel about it? Do you?
I love that question. It's so difficult, and I think the more ivory tower you are, the more imagination and effort it takes to find ways to do that. When the model essentially, for us in the West, is still pretty colonial in terms of we say all kinds of angry social justice messages in our work, but the method of a PhD student coming from the West to the rest is go get those 100 interviews and transcripts and all those materials, go back home and never be heard from by that community again. Even if your intentions are good and you write a book that's just full of compassion and social justice concerns and vibrant critique, etc., but what has become of the people you left behind? And there has been a fair amount of ink spilled in American anthropology about these kinds of ethical questions over the last 20 years. But I don't know that I've seen a ton of imaginative ways of really building reciprocity, except when there can be these kind of interdisciplinary communities of shared concern and maybe some funding mechanisms to produce real collaborative research. There's a methodological approach for us that's become quite popular for addressing these challenges. If there's no way you can reciprocate in terms of people in your community are unhealthy, I'm going to bring you resources that will make you more healthy. We often don't have the capacity to do that as academics, right? But community-based participatory research, often abbreviated as CBPR, right? We have, in my undergraduate program at Northwestern, we have an entire course in this for how to do research with vulnerable people in such a way that the research itself is co-owned and reciprocal, right? So that you design the research together, you own the data together, or they own that data, right, and have a right to it more ideally, right? But in the traditional setup of, you know, we're operating on Boasian and Levi-Straussian models of fieldwork still, in the mystique of the lone field worker who produces this pure theoretical, vibrant knowledge. So that being said, on the spectrum of medical anthropology in the West, there's one end of it that is deeply applied and that is really oriented toward working with people in health communities to solve very specific problems. And their real alliances with people using public health and epidemiological methods are possible and happen. To get to the point for me, this is, in terms of that research I did back in my 20s that was, you know, so powerful and so difficult. And again, a lot of folks took care of me. You know, my process was going around to all those NGOs till I found somebody who I activated the maternal instinct. You know, I've got, you know, speaking of methodological questions, this is not insignificant, the degree to which I have been mothered in the former Yugoslavia, you know, or have activated that impulse, and it has become an advantage for my research. So the organization that I finally found, Krila Nade, was run by a woman named Maya, who was like, yes, I want research here. I want all of this studied. I want to work with you. I want people to know what we do. And I value your personality and your interests, and I just like taking care of young people who are interesting to me, right? So I owe a lot to that organization and to that, and to Maya, the director in particular, and it took me years. I had a hiatus in Sierra Leone where, in order to get a job, speaking of the savage slot, right, totally racist, totally colonialist in Western anthropology, my Balkan work wasn't taking me very far in terms of interest from academia.
Not exotic enough.
not exotic enough, but oh, Sierra Leone, Ebola, life expectancy of 40, 1 in 8 women die in childbirth. Oh, that's real anthropology, right? So I had that hiatus of 3 summers working with a medical humanitarian organization there, and the reciprocity was I got my students to study questions they needed answered. So we helped them with information, which was basically all of your community health programs aren't working, here's why, right? But for Bosnia, what finally happened was I got this job at Northwestern, and they wanted me to run a summer school because international education is so important and part of our global privilege, right? You don't send students to Northwestern to study abroad with us, right? But we
There's an idea.
We don't have money, yeah.
Yeah. And you know, for 10 years with these programs, because I took students to Sierra Leone too. At Princeton, I was like, we have to get money through this to bring them here too. Otherwise, we're repeating 19th century stuff. And I've said the same thing about Yugoslavia, like, this only really feels good to me if there could also be a program that brings some of your students to us for a while, but we have to pay for it. We can't expect them to pay for it, right? And it would be a drop in the bucket for us to pay for these things. But the battles to extract, you know, there's just no economic or political rationale at American universities that supports that thinking. You run into a brick wall every time. So what happened finally was I got this summer school and I involved that psychosocial organization. I had them be part of the curriculum. They are the official mental health provider for my students who come over here, have their minds blown and have mental health breakdowns, right? And need some Zoom therapy. So they both provide care and they provide instruction on mental health and trauma in Bosnia, and it is much more effective than what we get from the doctors in the system, because being in civil society, they're much more oriented toward the broader socially contextualized experience of trauma.
They actually see people, not patients.
They actually, this is how I end one of my essays, is quoting my essay, and I'm asking, why have you become successful? Because they have in the last 15 years. When we started, they were precarious, had no money, you know the story, right? But they slowly built up word of mouth, and they're financially stable and well known. And I said, you know, how did this happen? And she said, because we actually take care of people. It's quite simple.
Yeah.
You know, so however we can build that, as medical anthropologists, we study care, but why do we study care? Because we care about care, right? Both academic research and teaching as a form of care in itself, and then our collaborations being forms of care for a perpetually broken world.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions, either here or potentially online? I can't really see them.
Yes, sir.
Professor?
My name is Vuk, and my engagement I'm retired now, but during my engagement I was dealing in something which I have called social acupuncture. And like in Chinese acupuncture, you diagnose points when there is stagnation, and you stimulate these points, and you established some kind of flow. Instead of stagnation, there is a flow of qi. It is a vital principle in each human being, qi. Are you familiar with qi?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I don't know too much about acupuncture, etc.
So you have mentioned care several times. But since recently we have a new development regarding care. In Europe, except United Kingdom, they call it
Complementary.
Complementary and alternative
Beg your pardon?
medicine, yeah.
Complementary and alternative.
No.
No.
They call it personalized medicine.
Personalized medicine.
In United Kingdom, they call it in United States or South America, they call it precision medicine. Precision medicine.
Precision medicine.
In United Kingdom, they call it stratified medicine. And the main principle is augmentation.
Augmentation of vitality and health rather than the negative approach to ill health.
Augmentation means actually the main principle in augmentation is biotechnological improvement of human beings.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So I would like to hear more from you about this, because we are now in Serbia witnesses that our government is very ambitious to establish Serbia as one of the leaders in this field. We have recently a big meeting, people from 20 countries. We had here a director of World Economic Forum, a guy from Sweden, I don't want to know his name. And we have artificial intelligence in four topics, in 4 regions. One of them is medicine and health. So it would be interesting for us to hear what you think about this new type of care. Personalized medicine or precision medicine or certified medicine.
If I could just interject with that. So
Yeah,
this idea of this 4th wave of how our government has posed this importance of biotechnology and the impact of biotechnologies on the ways in which care is perceived and provided here. This idea of having more tech, less people involved in how care is provided, and this notion intertwined with the notion of private, personalized medicine, which is sort of very Rosian in this sense of the patient has to know their particularities on the molar and the molecular level of themselves. So it's a topic that's kind of emerging very completely not critically in the ways in which our Ministry of Health has embraced new technologies as potentially a gap or solution to very much structural and infrastructural problems of the healthcare system. This is my interjection of how I read that.
Speaking pessimistically,
This is really interesting.
but yeah,
speaking pessimistically, anthropology will be dealing with keyboards.
keepers.
Keyboards.
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 Yeah.
Ah.
No. So the idea of technology as this sort of intermediary, or actually not even intermediary, but direct provider of care. I mean, here, I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I have many, but like in short, what I see is like this technologization constantly, going more personalized, I don't know, DNA analysis, this and that, doing precision, like targeting of your own system. It's just constantly kind of widening the gap between those that can and those that don't. And the health itself becomes an achievement of the rich and powerful,
and switching responsibility as well.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like, you're responsible for yourself.
Yes. But what I see among my friends even, and among people that are very far from privileged, I see this hope and idea into like being able to kind of tap into your own biology in a way that can prolong your life and stuff. But these are very sophisticated, high-tech, expensive type of procedures only available, and they will only ever, I think, be available to an exclusive top of the notch people, How do you make such a medicine available to everybody, or to
It would take a pretty good socialized medicine system with good state funding coming into it to make all that equitably accessible, right?
No, go for it. Thank you.
Is that the main question? How to make it available to everyone?
No.
I don't think it's the first one, or it's even the main one.
And it wouldn't be for you either.
Yeah.
We have now in the field that I'm familiar with, and that's the biggest field of caring about reproductive health.
Can you please?
Yes, I'm Jelena Stankovic. I'm a psychologist and maybe more precisely a social cultural psychologist, and I have the opposite direction into the field than you. That means that I finished psychology, and I actually am very close to anthropology, and I think that maybe I do more of anthropological research than psychological one.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. So, but just to react to what you said to Professor Stambolovic's question, based on what I saw in the field of maternal health, we have not just enough technology, we have more than enough. And it means that we use it irrationally, and it means that it is perceived as a solution to many questions that are not technological or even medical questions. And the thing is that I see it as a continuation of this uncritical, mechanicistic, Cartesian medicine, where we have to teach people. That is my problem with health psychology. Maybe that would be my field in psychology, would be health psychology. It is trying to bring something into the field of medicine, to teach the doctors or medical practitioners to also acknowledge these psychological aspects or social aspects. And we always pose the problem in these mechanistic terms. That means, okay, we understand the body, let's add the soul, or let's add the person, or let's add something, and it doesn't function like that. So the focus on technology is actually the continuation. We just have more now fancier things. The continuation of this idea that we are treating people in a way that we are treating the bodies, and then we will have the expert to treat the mental health, and then we will have the experts for policy, and they will treat our social problems, and it just doesn't function like that. And that is also, I didn't raise my hand because I don't have a specific question, although I had so many associations to both
have a lot to say.
I think we have so many intersections in how we think and what we do in our fields. But the field of mental health, I never went there as a psychologist because I don't feel comfortable with it. And the reason that I don't feel comfortable with it, I think it's a placeholder for everything now.
Yes.
You know, everything is like...
That's Gen Z.
Yeah, so it's like I would feel that they just contribute to that. You need a real critical distance from that, especially if you're a psychologist. And I would also say, because that is what you mentioned, what it is like in Croatia. In Serbia, as I know, we had the previous reaction, like after anti-psychiatric movement, we had changes, serious changes, even without this closing the asylums, etc. That didn't happen. But when you go to the biggest asylum still in Serbia, in Padinska Skela, you have a terrible, unimaginable situation, but also you have the remnants, like of occupational therapy, art therapy, something that was done during the socialist era, and it's not done now.
And I think this
kind
of,
if
we talk about this multiplication of technologies and everything, they also, what happens is it kind of clouds our judgment into seeing that the most effective types of care and medical care are these personal contacts, in the sense of like somebody that will tell you it's going to be okay, somebody that's going to show you the way, help you navigate the healthcare system, help you navigate your own, through all of this. That is definitely, and when you talk about these asylums, so in Croatia, there was this period of time after the Second World War, when everything was destroyed and there was like this building up of this asylum type of institutions in a way that they functioned as cities. Cities where doctors and nurses would live, and where they had cinema there, they had libraries there, they had kazalište, they had theater, a lot of arts and crafts. They also had, which is interesting, and depending on the time, they had agricultural work done there, and patients would be included in different types of agricultural work in all of this. But hospitals like Vrapče, for example, really functioned.
Total social institution.
Yeah, and it was a kind of strange thing. In a sense, it was both nice and very unexpected of the times when we're looking from this perspective now, you know, and also very, very total in the way that it's. But it's also interesting, how did it happen that this type of just kind of went in ruin? You only see, like, you see the leftovers, you see the art therapy, like, but you're not really sure, is it a leftover or is it something new? Because art therapy is also something very, like,
It's
hip
both.
now.
Did you see this great documentary about battle against tuberculosis in Yugoslavia?
No.
It's
Sorry.
very interesting. There is on YouTube, and you can see, like, during 50s and 60s, what they did with kids. They had school there. They invited singers, artists. It was amazing. You could see that it's poor. There is no money, and it's a lot, like, infrastructure is not great, but everything else was just kind of human.
So if I can have 30, I mean, just to go to this point, right? It's important that my Americanness is a value right now, because I can tell you that we use more technology in healthcare than anybody else in the world, and we have worse outcomes than all of our peers, especially in the area of maternal and child health, right? It is over-technologized, over-medicalized, and it's causing damage, right? Rather than actually improving our indicators in these areas. So this, to me, the idea of personalized, precision, other kinds of medicine, whatever you want to call it, it's clearly of a piece with grand ideological formations that are sometimes visible to us, sometimes not, but it slots right into, I mean, maybe this is a really simple and obvious point to make, but it slots directly into individualist neoliberal capitalism, right? Where it's an erasure of the social. It's an erasure of the social, and that context is being important to health. You are reduced to technology and the patient, perhaps even without the mediary of real human beings and that healing relationship. And if there's any insight that is universal across the history of medical anthropology, wherever it's done in any country, it's the relationship. That is what the placebo effect is. We found that all the SSRIs don't do anything more for depression and anxiety than the placebo effect, and I say don't dismiss that. What's actually happening there is that a person has cared enough to give you a pill. Yeah. A person has cared enough to develop a relationship with you, and that's the impact.
And to give you hope.
And they've given you hope, and that's the impact that's being measured there. So whatever works, a sugar pill or some actual, Lexapro, that's the thing, right? We also have to distinguish between medical anthropologists have a very different sense of what care means than the way it is operationalized within healthcare spaces is something instrumental and technological. Care in that world, it is my ethnographic impression, is about the management of suffering and suffering people. Management, and I have a slide in my Intro to Global Health course that I give to my student that just says in big letters, management does not equal care. Right? So it's entirely a political economic activity involved with driving down costs, et cetera, managing the healthcare system and managing suffering people in a biopolitical way, insofar as suffering people are always a burden on and an accusation against the reigning social structure. Right? So personal care, mental health is a basket for everything, ruins and remnants. Okay, there's a lot here on this.
No, thank you. I think what it's palpable from the audience as well and from our speakers, and I think Ivan and I are both like really trying not to interject as much as we can, but how much we are all passionate about this topic and how much it's not just a profession, but and I think we talked about it in a podcast before. It's a calling, right? To think and to care.
Which is also kind of Pandora's box.
Absolutely.
Well,
so I'd like to
because
that's why we're all exploited as academics.
Yes. But I'm going to take my position as one of the moderators here, because we're really running low on time, as to sort of bring this to a close with this the positivity of it and the productivity of it. I think you're absolutely right. And I'm really thankful for our audience coming from various backgrounds, talking about various aspects of healthcare and care and approaches to it. We see, I come back to friction and fragments. So both the ways in which care is provided or managed, but the ways in which we think and talk about care is also fragmented, and fragmented in various ways of how we're approaching this topic, where our accesses are coming, we're not being allowed to access things, and how that sort of creates new productivity. So when one door closes, you think about opening another one for various avenues. I mean, we can all sit about these have a whole different open talk about how when one door closed, it opened possibilities for another one when we talk about research. So this fragmentation within us also happens, but I'm trying to be very concise here and not really working it. So the idea of shared concerns is I think something that could be possibly a theoretical thread to bring us back to understanding medical anthropology here, promoting it, making it more visible in that sense, and bringing these fragments together, not to make a complete piece. We had a great sociologist here just a few days ago who gave this example of, he talked about sociology and medical approaches in sociology. He talked about puzzles, and this sort of puzzle that's always being added into a new piece into it. So it's never going to be a complete puzzle. I really like that metaphor. And I think it's very key for us as well. But to sort of work together and map these open conversations, these open wounds of where we see problems and where we care for those people that we are working with and they're sharing their concerns is really, really crucial. I'm very grateful to, first of all, to be housed in an institute that really privileges engaged thought and engaged research and working regionally and working interdisciplinary. And I think that's something where talks like this and future collaborations are places where we can work to actually help, as Ivan said, help the people that we're working with, care with them. And I invite you all, if you haven't heard about our conference, in the frictions, care, health, and well-being in the Balkans. We already have, I think, around 70.
Can I still apply for that?
No, it's closed. You can come in another capacity. But
you will get a special invitation.
But I invite you all to take a look, and if you come visit us in Zadar in April, from April 27th until April 30th. We actually got a Werner grant for that, so we got recognized by the American Anthropological Association.
The most elite funder of anthropology stuff.
This is the second grant to be given in the category of workshops and conferences in the Balkans. Yeah, the first one was Charna Brkovic, well, giving a shout out right now. It's really, we should capitalize on this opportunity, and I want to thank Ivan for this collaborative introducing Peter to us. I want to thank Jelena and Peter for taking the time to. It's really been, as we've seen, a contingency, a kismet of things occurring. Jelena was supposed to teach medical anthropology today, and yet she's here in Belgrade teaching anthropology. Peter joined us as well, so all of these things occurred in this, I don't know, complete serendipity, I think is the word that's coming to my mind. So I want to thank Locke for that. And thank you all for coming, and we can of course continue this conversation in another setting. And thank everyone from Zoom for listening in, taking notes. Students, you will be quizzed.
Thank you to my students. See you next week.
Even if you want to say something as well for closing.
No, not really. Like, I will just say thank you again, Jelena and Peter, and I think we had a great conversation.
I think so.
Like, I really enjoyed.
This was such a privilege, really. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.